All right, let's let let a few people get on. So tonight we got Old Forester 1920. I needed a strong one for the fueling discussion. So this guy comes in at what do we got? 115 proof. So that should do. This is one of my absolute favorite bottles, though. Just gonna give it a couple more minutes. Let a few more people get on. Feel free to comment if you guys are having any issues seeing or hearing me. I think I've dumbed down the quality of the broadcast enough that this tiny tuning computer can make it through, but all right. One more minute and then we'll get going. Oh man, Rach, I just saw that text. All right, let's get this going. So, all right. So, I'm gonna go through fueling today. I've been obviously I've been contemplating doing this for a long time. The link that I put in the description and on the Facebook post too. That link is going to take you to a Google Doc that I'll be walking through tonight. So feel free to go there and pull it up because it'll be probably easier for you to see. I tried to get it. I tried to get it so that we'll be able to see it on the stream, but it's not showing up perfectly. So But yeah, I've been thinking about. I wrote this fueling doc. Uh, God, um, probably almost 2 years ago at this point. Um, so I've been thinking about doing this for a while, but I just kind of needed a reason, and today felt like a good reason. Um, so let's do it. All right. A lot of this is going to be really basic concepts, but what I've been seeing lately, at least in the last few weeks, is that some of the really basic concepts are not, are getting missed by people. Um, so we'll go through them. Feel free to ask any questions. Um, I will answer anything. Um, yeah. So first off, LTG is it's a direct injected engine. So direct injection has been around for quite some time now. I originally got into direct injection in 2008 with the Mazda Speed Dizzy MZR. So that's really where I got my start. So went through all kinds of stuff with that platform and not being able to make power and not understanding why engines were blowing up at 300 and 300 horsepower bone stock, not understanding why people couldn't make power even with giant turbos on those cars, and kind of walked through the whole life cycle of how those started and how that engine started with direct injection to where they are today, um, which actually I've been out of the game for the Mazda game since like 2016, 17, 2017. But yeah, shout out to Bryce, who actually just he just ran like in 890s at 177 miles an hour. That thing trapped. So that's where I see us being able to go. It's just will take a little while. So biggest reason for that is fueling. So going over just a couple of basic terms, we have the way that our fuel system works is you have a low pressure fuel pump in the tank that feeds up to a high pressure fuel pump that's cam driven off of the camshaft. That goes to your high pressure fuel rail, um, and then to your high pressure injectors, your direct injectors. So um, your fuel pressure from the tank is coming in at anywhere from, hopefully, if you have enough pressure, 60 to 80 psi. That's then getting compressed by your high pressure fuel pump, and then that's getting to your injectors at anywhere between 2500 and 3500 psi. And then those injectors that are fitted directly into the head in the combustion chamber, those are then spraying at that pressure. Um, some of those I use some of those 25 to 3500 as a pretty wide range, but that is tunable. It's also whether you have stock injectors or you have some of the Nostrum injectors, they may want to run at different pressure levels or have different limits on the pressure levels. Okay, but the basics are just that low pressure fuel pump feeds at a normal pressure that we're used to hearing from forever as soon as fuel injection began at 60 to 80 psi, and then you have your high pressure fuel pump and your high pressure injectors. So that's the stock system. Um, so just diving into that a little deeper, each of those pieces. Um, so the in tank or low pressure fuel pump, the limits on that pump are just governed by your total fuel volume requirement. So how much fuel you need to get from the tank into the engine. It doesn't care about RPM. It doesn't care about anything else other than your just total volume requirement. On the flip side, the introduction of direct injection Okay, that's limited by the volume requirement of the engine, but it's also limited by RPM. And the reason it's limited by RPM is because with direct injection, you have a much smaller window to inject the fuel than with a normally port injected engine. Okay, so those are the two big things to remember. Low pressure fuel pump, just overall volume. High pressure fuel pump, high pressure fuel pump and injectors, limited by your overall volume and or volume requirement and your RPM. So when you look at people talking about upgrades for these, you're really your low pressure fuel pump is what starts it all. Your low pressure fuel pump being able to provide enough volume to the high pressure fuel pump is what kicks the whole thing off. So it's less overlooked right now. There's a lot more people talking about upgrading to the ZL1 pump or something similar. But it really is what starts the whole process. So it's one of the things you need to look at right away. So I'm not going to go through every single thing in this. You can read everything, every word that I've written if you want, but we will just kind of bounce around and go through the summary of it. So with the pros and cons, with the pros of DI, most of it has been basically for fuel efficiency. And a cleaner burn. It provides a lot of cylinder cooling in specific parts of the cylinders, and that's something we can talk about down the road as far as why it actually impacts these catastrophic failures that we see. If you're only running on DI because you don't get a consistent cooling of the piston and the cylinder, but it does typically allow you to run a leaner burn, a cleaner burn, and run leaner for the same power levels without having knock issues. Cons we talked about already, which is you're going to get only 350 degrees of actual time for your fuel injection. If you think about an entire 4-stroke cycle, you're looking at 720 degrees. You don't have that. You don't have near that amount of time with just direct injection. So that's one of the major cons. So along with that, I wanted to get into basically, there's only two ways to provide more fuel with direct injection. Number one is to increase the size of your injectors like you would a normally port injected car. That is so the thing with that is right off the bat, not many places ever made a larger injector for direct injection like they did for regular port injection. Okay, so for years and years, that wasn't even an option. Now, XDI came out with some stuff on some other platforms, and they've done great things with direct injection upgrades. And then obviously Nostrum for the LTGs and other platforms have come out with those as well. So increasing the size of your injectors, fine, that's what you would normally do. But that comes with its own cons. Reliability and longevity, tunability, the expense itself for that injector set. I think I have down here, and I haven't looked. You see, I haven't updated this since November of 2020. So This could be totally different now, but it's expensive to get a set of direct injected, larger injectors. So a lot of cons when it comes to that. The other way to add fuel capability with your direct injectors is to increase the pressure. So in a nutshell, the what you have to do is find a way to inject more fuel in a very short window. Okay, so increase the injector size, increase the fuel pressure. Either of those will do that. There's a lot more that comes with it when you try to do either of those things, but those are the ways that you can make that happen. So Paul, timing first or fueling first when tuning? Um, with a car that actually, in general, I would say fueling. Um, it gets a little weird. It gets a little weird, especially like around idle and stuff like that. But what I've actually found is my fueling in the idle areas affects my idle timing more than even like my torque tables and things of that nature. So I ended up, I was playing around with not just my overall timing, but with my transients and things like that, and just how the car was feeling. And I was immediately jumping both to my timing, my base timing tables, but then also to my virtual torque tables. And because I wasn't always seeing what I wanted, and what I ended up finding out in the end was that I was actually my VE tables for fueling were actually way over fueling um, more than I thought, and what that was doing was it was immediately pretty much everywhere in my low load areas. It was causing it to not follow my timing tables at all. So that's one reason that I say fueling first. The other is I believe a lot more um, you have a lot more space to play when your fueling is dialed in, and that's just kind of how. Also, at the end of the day, it's just kind of how I like to do it. Um, with that said, I mean, on all my cars in general that I've done, um, I have a pretty significantly modified timing table that I always start with. So I guess it's kind of a non-answer answer. I did kind of totally change the way the timing tables are set up, so that technically is what I do first. But I would say my priority as soon as I get a car is to really go through and get the fueling locked down, and that's how I get more um, consistency out of the other changes that I make, like timing. So long-winded answer, but fueling first. All right. Crazy, I know, me giving a long-winded answer. It's never happened before. Okay, so we've gone over kind of how to make more power, get more fueling available from just a direct injected setup. Some of these numbers, these are from Nostrum's website, but basically, you know, you could fully upgrade your DI system, and they claim the ability for 450 wheel horsepower on E85 and 640 on 93, but then your RPM is still very limited in that case. So that's with everything at the time. That's with the big bore pump and the large injectors. I know they came out with a smaller set that seemed to be really nice, but with their largest setup, you're looking at maximum power of 450 on E85, 640 on 93. You'll never make 640 on 93 octane with this car at 9.5 to 1 compression. I mean, I know Chris makes 560 ish, somewhere in that range on 93 only. That's with a very large turbo, really efficient setup, and is probably still close to that knock limit. So again, with just DI, you're basically looking at maximum in the 550 to 575 wheel horsepower range. If you get everything that you possibly can upgrade wise. So that brings us into port injection PI. So there's a lot of great things about adding PI. I use PI as a broad term that means any fueling that is injected before the actual chamber. So your direct injectors are directly into the head. Anything that you inject before that, whether it be in the intake manifold with 4 injectors, whether it be methanol somewhere in the intake manifold, whether it be methanol somewhere in a cold pipe or in the throttle body, whether it be the 6-port in the throttle body or in the cold pipe. Whether it be any of those things, that's what we will refer to as DI in this case. Okay, there's no reason to break it down any further. We're talking about normal injection that happens before the combustion chamber. Okay, so some of the pros to that, the one of the biggest ones that gets overlooked seriously consistently is the cleaning of the intake valves. I don't know how many people have seen how bad the intake valves get on all of these DI only cars, but it's terrible, and that does a lot of things. We won't get into all of it, but 2 of them are it increases the weight of your valves. Right, you're adding carbon on top of that valve that increases the weight, makes it harder to close. The other thing it does is with all that carbon there, you are asking for knock events. You're asking for any of that carbon that breaks off and enters into that combustion process. It's really something that people I don't think talk about enough when it comes to a performance application like this. So at DI of any kind, you get cleaning of the intake valves. You have now that unlimited fueling window. You can spray for the entire 720 degrees of that process. Your fueling capability is not limited by RPM. It's not limited by RPM because your window does not shrink the same way that it does with DI, right? Because with DI and only 330 degrees to inject ish, somewhere in there, as your RPM goes up, your time gets so short. That's why people talk about, so you'll hear a lot of people talk about pulse width, and pulse width is important, but it is not near as important as actual calculated injector duty cycle. In general, yes, you can, if you're looking at a stock or stock-ish car, you can look at a consistent pulse width limit, whether that be 5 milliseconds or 6 milliseconds or whatever, right? But what people don't understand, or at least don't talk about much, is that pulse width is just it's just governed by that pulse width limit is just governed by your RPM. So if you're running 6 milliseconds at 3,000 RPM and 6 milliseconds at 5 and 6 milliseconds at 7, it's not an issue at all, any type of limit, until you get up to 7,000, 8,000 RPM. Okay, and when I'm talking about building some of these bigger cars with bigger turbos and things like that, there's no reason this engine. This is a perfectly set up 2 liter, that wants to rev. It has a almost perfect rod stroke ratio. This car wants to rev, limiting it, at the 6,000 RPM that a stock turbo can make is nutty. And then taking and having the ability to put big turbos on it, but then still having an RPM limit because you can't get enough fuel there, that sucks, right? So PI solves that problem as well. So now let's get a little bit more into what I pretty clearly believe is the best approach, and that's DI plus PI. Okay, so you're gonna keep normal driving up till, let's say on a stock system, 300, 300, 350 horsepower. Um, your car is just your normal DI setup, nothing intruding. There's no bigger DI injectors to figure out tuning, scaling, anything like that. You don't have to upgrade any of that. You then, once you need the power, you're getting now all the benefits of PI, of spraying on the intake valves. If you spray before, if you spray early enough, if you spray your DI injectors early enough or your meth early enough in the stream, you're also going to see a significant charge air temperature reduction, which also means more power, which also means less heat, which also means more safety. When you're talking about pistons that like to explode frequently, the cooler, the more efficient, the more even you can make those cylinders while that combustion is going on, the better off you're going to be. There is a reason that my car ran 25,000 miles before I took this turbo kit off recently, at over 430, 450 wheel horsepower. There's a reason that I could do that while so many other cars have pistons that, I think I have one here actually, have pistons that look like this, right, on a stock tune, 300 horsepower. Funny enough, like that piston is actually from one of Jonathan's cars. That was his daily, the stock car, whereas his race car that has the 6-port on it has been running for 3 years, and the only thing it finally did was it bent all the rods because it was making so much power. But I mean, that goes to show you right there, how much added safety you can have by just adding some sort of PI. And one thing I want to be really clear about right now, I believe very much in my 6-port kit. There's plenty of reasons for it. But if you're on a budget, or you are not looking to make a ton of power or anything like that, highly, highly, highly recommend adding in just a cheap meth kit. At least get some of the fail safes and stuff like that. But you can get a good AEM meth kit for like $700 or something, and you're gonna get all of this, all the cooling, all of the octane boost, especially if you live somewhere where you don't have E85 around you. You're gonna get all of the cleaning of the valves, all that stuff. So I highly recommend adding some sort of PI without a doubt. It's truly the best of both worlds. It really is. Okay. All right, so we'll go through a little bit of some of the tuning theory throughout this. So I say it in here, and you can't really see the numbers on the stream anyway, but don't try to copy any of these numbers. They will not work. So, what you see in the first image is a stock math curve, no supplemental fueling. This is, this is basically your airflow model. It's telling the engine, um, telling the PCM how much airflow it should be expecting, which then allows it to say how much fuel it's going to need. Pretty easy. So the next thing that we'll look at is a typical meth injection type of curve, and I made things very apparent here. It's not necessarily going to be this stark of a contrast, but I just want to be able to show that on paper. So what you see here is you're going to have you're going to have your normal math curve line up to a certain point, and then that's when you're going to have your meth kick in, your auxiliary fuel kick in, and then from that point you're kind of going to go down a percentage, and that might happen a little more gradually than this, right? But you'll go down a percentage, but then that math curve is still going to go up, and in turn your required fueling from the DI system is also still going to increase. Okay, so you've basically taken um, it's basically taken a stock curve, and you get up to where you're becoming limited. Oh man, I didn't realize I didn't have the PDF up this whole time. Well, hey, I didn't have. It's fine. Before this, I was just going through I was just going through all text anyway. So finally to the images anyway. So hopefully you guys who were here in the beginning listen to my suggestion and follow the link and grab this PDF on your own. But if not, you didn't miss anything other than text. So here I'll go back up to the initial math curve. Um, so again, this is stock math curve. This is going to be your basic type of line that you'll see on any car. There's plenty of different calibrations that you want to do, things like that. But this is going to be the general curve that you're going to see. Now, if we run back down to the curve that would be for meth injection, it could also be for any other PI like a 6-port. It's really all in the way that you like to tune, your preference. But so now that we get down to this one, what you're going to see is that same following the stock math curve, but then it drops down a percentage here, and then it's going to continue back up. And what you've done is you've gotten to where you're hitting a limit up here for the amount of fuel from the DI system that you have. Okay, so you add your meth in. It comes, let's say it starts in here, and it's full on by this 13,000 hertz. Now your meth is full, 100%. It can't raise any higher, right? So what happens now, because you're still going to make more power, there's going to be more airflow. Well, what happens is now your DI has to keep increasing and increasing and increasing. Okay, so you've picked up some headroom, but not a ton. What I recommend is if you're looking for in that 15 to 20% or so more fuel than the DI system alone can make, I think Meth is a great option, especially I'll say again, especially if you do not have E85 available, or you at the even worse, you have like shitty 91 octane, or California, like if you have California 91 or Canadian, or you know, you can adding meth injection is gonna make the biggest difference for you. Now, I want to be very clear with that. I do not recommend it for making power at all. Okay, meth injection, you are not using pulse width modulation. You are not using actual fuel injectors. It's it's basically taking a water hose and changing out the nozzle size on how that water sprays. Okay, um, it's fine for the added benefits of cleaning and cooling. I do not recommend it for significant additional fueling. Again, 15-20%. I'm talking about people who, maybe are running like a 20G hybrid, something like that. Even like a Z series, like a Z54, the MHI turbo, something like that, and you want to maybe make your consistent, 400 horsepower, 420 horsepower. Above that, it's way too risky. I've seen way too many times where meth cannot be controlled precisely enough, and you have a shift where fuel is cut. There's enough leftover meth in a manifold that is then in your chambers. That's then enough fuel to keep that combustion going. And I have seen meth cut straight through heads like it's butter. Um, Highly do not recommend using meth as a significant source of added fuel. We'll leave it at that. So now we're going to go down to the auxiliary fuel, the real PI injectors, kind of how that looks from a tune perspective, what that graph looks like. Again, you don't have to set it up like this when you tune for these, but this is how I have always done it. Back in the day, in like 2010, 11, 12, I've tried every way under the sun, and this is where I landed on, and have done it that way since. But big thing here is you're looking at a pulse width modulated controller and injector setup. So this is just like any other PI car out there that's running on only PI injectors. You have a precise pulse width amount by RPM that you're injecting per injector. And that is, you're seeing a true tack signal, at least with my 6-port, you are seeing a true tack signal. And you're injecting based on that with, say, 1000cc injectors in my kit. So the big thing about your having that pulse width modulation is now you don't have this same issue where you just are turning on a meth pump, and it's hitting 100% basically, and then you're having to cover the rest of that with DI. What you can do now is, you see, I get up to where my limit begins, all right, and I flatline that math curve. Now, what that's going to do is that's going to flatline the amount of DI fuel that the PCM is requesting. Okay, so the way that I calculate that is through logs. I find out where my injector duty cycle on the DI side is right where I want it, right? Where it's not quite at the limit, but it's backed off a bit from that. The car runs great. I find out what hertz and meth hertz that I'm at, and then that becomes my cap. Okay, so I cap that off. That says, okay, DI run up to say 25, 30%, whatever it is, injector duty cycle. Stop right there, and then on the PI side, now I have this ability to complete the rest of the curve with all of my PI. So the PI injectors, I can say start at 1 millisecond here, 2 milliseconds here, 3 milliseconds here, 5 milliseconds here. So I can gradually increase the amount of PI fuel that is being injected, and I can do that through the controller. Again, the controller that I use in my kits is a split second box, and in that split second box, you can tune it with a very simple software, but very effective, that is going to look at your map voltage, and it's going to look at your tach signal, and that's going to now cover this huge area. So if we do a quick back to back, if you tune it this way, or if you are just doing math, you're getting a set amount of added fuel, and then your stock DI has to continue upward to cover the rest until it runs out again. When you are using a 6-port system or other similar PI system, you can use your PI to cover the rest of the curve. Your DI stays flatlined, so you're never pushing it past its limit, or even past its perfect efficiency range. Okay, so a lot of words there. So I'm going to drink now. Man, this is really good. If you weren't on right away, Old Forester 1920. This is one of my absolute go-to favorites. 115 proof. It'll bite you, but it's delicious. All right, so at the end of this, I just put in also what a VE table, how you do a similar calibration scaling for the VE table. Now, this only needs to really be done if you are tuning your VE only. So if you're doing only speed density, you disable the math. But that's what we got there. And then I just add some closing comments. It's pretty simple. DI is great for a lot of reasons, but I personally believe that a mixture of both DI and PI is the way to go. I've gone through in detail exactly why I feel those ways. So that is why I developed originally 3 years ago a 6-port kit for at that time my buddy Jonathan's car. He ran that stock engine originally with the Evo 9 turbo, just a stock Evo 9 turbo, for a couple years. Made over 450 wheel horsepower. That car trapped 121 in the quarter mile, full weight manual transmission car. And again, that was on a bone stock engine on E85. Okay, so from that point, we proved that out on the LTG, and then I put one of those kits on my car, ran that for close to a year. I had made some tweaks then on what the kit was gonna look like, and then my car, again, making the same 450 wheel horsepower for 25,000 miles on a bone stock engine, and it's still good. I'm just switching over to testing out the MHI turbo and doing some things with that. But it'll still be on the same 6 port kit. Um, Highly recommended for anybody who's looking to push these, or to just um, add some safety, to add some cooling, um, all of those things. Um, Obviously, uh, they're you know, I'll say this: 6 ports have been out there for a long time. I personally was part of creating those back in, like I said, 2010, 11, for the Mazda speeds, and there are a few different versions of those 6 ports that are out there for the Mazda speeds. I then, brought that here and started doing the same. It works great. Um, there are, now, as we saw yesterday, it looks like we're going to get another player in the game. Um, quite honestly, I thought it was going to come earlier, guys. Uh, there's there's different philosophies on how to run that efficiently and effectively, and you know it's a beautiful piece. There are some things that I love about it. Um, I would recommend, you know, I won't knock anybody until testing gets done, and things like that. Um, there are obviously some things that I see that I did do differently, and I would continue and will continue to do differently on my kit. So no hard feelings to anybody. Can leave it at that. Um, but yeah, if anybody has fueling questions, anybody has questions about more specifically on the 6 port design. So, this whole thing was really to talk about just the overall fueling, um, the, from the basics of how this car is run, and how I believe you can get the best and the most out of your car. But if you have any specific questions on the exact design of the 6 port kit, that I did, um, and that I still run. If you have any specific questions on that, um, feel free to message me. Happy to answer them. But yeah. So that's I think that's about all we have. Um, I'll stick around for a little bit just in case anybody um, wants to drop any questions or comments. Um, I guess we can get into a couple other things because it was kind of quick. So while I have this piston here with me, we can talk about the fact that this is what a DI piston looks like. Most everybody has seen this. This is an LTG piston, clearly because there's no ringland there. But if you notice, these pistons with this deep and small pocket for the fuel injection, that is a very clear indication that it's a DI engine. So what happens with these is the design is for the injector to spray fuel directly at this bowl. It will then essentially ricochet and provide fuel directly around the spark plug in the best and cleanest way that it can. Okay, so that's great for efficiency. One thing it is really bad for, especially when you get these pistons that have a very defined pocket for your DI fueling. One of the big problems that you see is a very uneven distribution of heat in the combustion chamber and through the piston itself. Um, I haven't looked at enough of these specifically to be able to tell if it's more of a chamber issue or more of a piston issue when it comes to heat. But that's essentially what this was designed for. But one of the cons that isn't talked about much, because you got to remember that these cars were not meant for all out performance. Now, the reason that I bring this into the equation right now is because one of the nice things also that happens when you add DI and PI together is you're gonna get this great, um, you're gonna get this really nice clean burn when you're not making a lot of heat in the combustion chamber itself. So your low load, all of that, when your PI is not spraying, you're gonna get all those benefits of that clean burn. But what's gonna happen is once your PI starts spraying, you're gonna still have that same ricochet, that same chamber effect, or fuel effect in the chamber. And but what you're also going to have happen is you have all of this extra fuel that has been cooling your intake charge. It's then been spread out, let's say in a six port sense. It's been spread out throughout your intake manifold, and now all of that fuel, that cool fuel, is now entering into the rest of the combustion chamber. Okay, so that's going to help more evenly cool the chamber and the piston like a normally PI engine would. Okay, so that's another benefit that can really help, especially if you're really pushing a stock turbo or a small big turbo, like a hybrid. If you're really pushing those and pushing the heat to the max and all of those things, adding PI to the mix will help immensely with your piston health. It's huge. Um, so much so that what ends up happening on really big, some of the really big power cars in the DI world is they actually switch back to a flat top PI piston, um, and they don't even bother with that DI bowl at all. Opinion between pre and post throttle body on the six port. Oh man, I might need to pour a little more whiskey for that question. I want to start by saying this. I want to reiterate that I have not tested uh, the certain new product that I'm sure this is being referred to. I've not tested that, and they've been very clear that they plan to do adequate testing. So I'm not going to say anything about what will happen with that versus where I've chosen to put my injectors. But I will give you my experience um, from all the way back in the Mazdas to now. So, and why I've chosen to put my injectors where I have. So, back in the Mazda days originally, one of the things that was done was throttle body spacer was one, and then also there was a freeze plug that was near the throttle body, um, that was right below the throttle body, basically in the intake manifold. And what people were doing was, oh, that's a great place. We could just tap. We could tap right there. Okay, and what people were finding was that they were having issues with fuel distribution, so even distribution between ports, and the biggest issue though that ended up happening. Now this was more with meth nozzles than it was with actual um, pulse width modulated injectors. But the biggest issue that people were having was um, after it was either injectors that fired a little bit after, or it was with meth nozzles that always leak some. And there was pooling in the intake manifolds, and there were catastrophic failures um, because of that for various reasons. Um, after those kind of initial designs on the Mazda, we pulled everything back away from the throttle body a little bit. Originally, it was a company called Ross Machine Racing. They made the fuel rail assemblies. So we took that and we pulled that back a few inches, really as far as we could, and then changed the angle of the injection to make sure that it was really promoting the best um, promoting the best atomization, um, to go along with the airflow into the throttle body. Okay, so that's something that I definitely brought with me to the LTG. So what I did was I took and pulled that the injectors as far back as I could away from the throttle body, while still being plenty upstream of any sensors or anything of that nature, right? So we don't want fuel spraying directly on the map sensor that's in the cold pipe, for instance. So we get above that, but as far away from the throttle body as we can. That's going to give your fuel injection from your PI injectors. That's going to give that enough time, especially with the injectors that I chose as far as size wise. It's going to give it enough time to be fully atomized by the time that it's entering into the intake manifold. And why is that important? And this is, something that I've seen brought up a bunch of times that I've answered a million times, and I laugh now at this. So everybody, I shouldn't say everybody. There's one specific human being that will not get off of me on this, and tries to get everybody on the side with this. But talking about your fuel distribution when you inject it, um, where I am now. He says TBI injection, so maybe he's just thinking more along the lines of when it's injected after the throttle plate right into the intake manifold, which I could understand his concerns there. But with where I inject, you're gonna get an atomized mixture, and that is then gonna enter through your throttle body into your plenum. So at that point, you're looking at, the air, which is fluid, and your fuel, which is fluid. When I say atomized, it's an atomized mixture, meaning that it is one now fluid mixture. So that gets brought into your plenum and then distributed to your cylinders. So why does that work so well? And why do you not get uneven fuel distribution? Well, in all of these engines, between your head, your intake manifold, your exhaust manifold, you do have a flow imbalance between your different cylinders, and you can definitely see that in various ways when you look at spark plugs on stock cars, when you look at which pistons blow, things like that. So let's say, for instance, cylinder 3, the way everything flows, cylinder 3 it runs the leanest. Okay, so what's going to happen now is you're injecting fuel before the throttle body. You're injecting it, 6 inches before in the charge pipe. That's atomized mixture is then going through the throttle body into the plenum. That's one mixture now that is then being pulled from by each of your, um, you know, by each cylinder. So what ends up happening, and we found this really early on with the Mazdas, and it kind of happened by accident, is we found all of a sudden, because the Mazdas, the MZRs have their stock intake manifolds. It flows horribly in um, as far as imbalance between cylinders. It's a 30, like up to 30%. But what we found was all of a sudden we're injecting this fuel before the throttle body, and now our spark plugs are all looking really even. We're not seeing near as much knock. All of these things. Well, how is that happening? Well, it's happening because when you're injecting this fuel, now your cylinders that were getting the most air are now also the cylinders that are getting the most fuel. I could argue this till I'm blue in the face, and I have for years. Uh, the bottom line is that's how it works in the real world. It's just how it works. But that's my very long response on why I personally placed my injectors out before the throttle body as far as possible as would fit. It also allowed me in that area, just so happened to allow me to have my injector angle as steep as I wanted it to be. Another small but very critical part of that is it allowed me to get my injector tips far enough into an open area that once they spray and the cone expands, that cone would not be hitting anything right around it. The problem, if you take and you kind of pull those injectors out of the stream some, and they're in their own boss a little bit out of the stream, when those spray, they may look fine, right? But when those spray, immediately they create this cone pattern. And if you don't have those injectors directly into now the large, 2.5, 3-inch pipe, parts of that cone are hitting something, being obstructed, and they're now doing this, right? All over the place, hitting each other, not atomizing correctly. And now you're not getting that nice atomized mixture through the throttle blade. You are getting dripping into either your cold pipe or directly dripping into your intake manifold. And that's not something you want at all. That's the most, I'll probably go into that right now. So, lastly, updates on the low pressure fuel pump. So I got, last week I got some mixed updates. The print, the print of the revised version was finished, but some more updates needed made. The big thing, one of the big things we're having trouble with is getting the little clips. So there's like 4 or 5 little clips on the outside of that top hat. Getting those perfect so that they will clip in the right spot and the right depth and everything has kind of been a pain in the ass. So Machinist is reprinting that. I'm hoping that by the end of this week I will have an update on where that print is. If it is good to go, then it'll be ready to test in my car. I can't wait because the ZL1 pump, however great it has been for allowing me to run E85 completely, it's been a huge pain in the ass to only be able to run half my tank down. Still don't know exactly what happened. I know a bunch of people have had this issue. I know the install was horrendous to try to get some of the connections. In the end, it was just a huge pain. So I don't know if I messed something up. I don't know if it just flat out doesn't work. I feel like there's at least a few people who don't have this issue with not being able to pull from the passive side of the tank. But we're gonna keep pushing forward with the low pressure fuel pump. Hopefully, have an update by the end of this week. If I do get that for testing in the next couple weeks, I still have to put my car back together, which means turbo install, got to fab a downpipe intake, all that stuff. So my tentative plan, and also what lines up with when there won't be snow on the ground anymore, is mid-April. I hope to start testing this the low pressure fuel pump. So, all right. If there's no other questions, I think we've gone through quite a bit tonight. But this will post back up tomorrow. Feel free to ask any questions after that you want, and anything I missed. And until then, cheers.